All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Red War Revelry, Emerging Revolutionary War. Coming with you here to talk about Revolutionary War battlefields, what we like about them, preservation, our favorite ones that have been lost to history. Today, I am joined, and I'll go from my left to right, with Dan Davis, Senior Education Manager for the American Battlefield Trust. Also a de facto emerging Revolutionary War historian, whether he wants to admit it or not. And also here's Billy Griffith. He is the author of A Handsome Flogging, The Battles of Monmouth, as part of the Emerging Revolutionary War series, Battlefield or a book on Lake George with the History Press, and still is a avid New York Yankees fan. So we will have some AL East rivalries here tonight. So thank you, gentlemen, both for joining and talking Red War battlefields here. And so let's kick it off. We'll start with this time. I'll start with Billy, go from north to south here. What is your favorite Revolutionary War battlefield and why?
I know I wrote the book on Monmouth for us, but I'm gonna have to say my favorite Revolutionary War battlefields to visit are either Saratoga or Yorktown. I think Saratoga is just because the natural region around it has not changed as much since the 18th century. It really, there's a feel there, and there you can definitely feel that power of place when you are there. It's one of those few battlefields that are nearly completely fully preserved, that you can visit all the sites of the various actions, and loving the history of the upstate New York region in the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. Saratoga and the Saratoga campaign was always one that I was immediately drawn to.
How about Dan, are we staying north or going southern campaigns?
I'll stay north and go south. I definitely agree with Billy about Saratoga. It's just a beautiful spot. If you've never had the opportunity to visit, feel free, take advantage of it. It's in a great spot. There's plenty of places. I mean, it is still somewhat secluded, but thus it's in very good shape from a preservation standpoint. But I'm going to go south to South Carolina and Eutaw Springs. Eutaw Springs, I think, is one of my favorite, if not my favorite Revolutionary War battlefield. I think part of that is because not only is one of the last major engagements in South Carolina in the fall of 1781, but because of the archaeology that's been done there, we know now that much more of the battlefield actually has been preserved, when at one point in time, due to the construction of Lake Marion, that the battlefield was at one time thought to be lost, but fortunately for us today, it isn't. My favorite part of that battlefield is the road that Nathaniel Greene's army takes to actually reach the battlefield and engage the British. And you really get a sense there. The road has not changed since 1781. And you really get a sense of, you can drive it, you can walk it. You really get a sense that you're stepping back into time and you're seeing exactly what the Continental soldiers and British soldiers saw when you travel that road.
Well, that's a good pick. When you went to South Carolina, I thought you were going to steal mine, Mr. Davis, and that's cow pens and a devil of a whipping. I feel like you get up into the up country, you stand on those the lines, the markers there that they have for where the first, second, and third American lines were. And I know I might be called a homer here because there are Maryland troops on that last line, but I just think the success and just standing, there's only certain places in the United States where you can stand on such a pivotal part and be there sometimes without another single living human soul. And you can go to Cowpens and stand there and realize that, like, what that did, of course, wrecked the left flank of General Cornwallis's approach. I mean, tarnished Bannister Tarleton there. Actually created a wedge in some of the troops that wanted to serve with Tarleton. I think it was the Royal Welsh Fusiliers or whatever. Like they were done with the man after that. They didn't want to go with him to Charlottesville later on. And it also inspired. I mean, Daniel Morgan, you see that copied again, unsuccessfully though, at two other battles. One, Guilford Courthouse by Greene, who did it somewhat successfully, and then later on in a war that Dan and I were just talking about last weekend, Bladensburg, in the War of 1812, that defense in depth. the double envelopment that Wayland Washington's cavalry does, the understanding. They said what a great leader understands the men underneath them, and Morgan spending the night. How cool would it have been like a militiaman standing out there on the front line? Here comes Daniel Morgan down to have a drink or sit in the fire with you, or sit next to the fire and just say, "Give me 2 shots, boys," and then run, go, peace out. I mean, it's like, okay, I can do that for the old wagoner. So I just feel like it's just an amazing count. That walk up from the visitor center and everything there. And I mean, the double whipping, I mean, that's just the terminology there just makes you smile as well. So, and I also gained a fan already. Nancy from said Cowpens, yeah! Exclamation point. Morgan did everything right, even when events were not under his control. And that's sometimes, I mean, even John Edgar Howard on the last line understanding the order, and actually the retrograde movement a little bit actually helped out. So for once, not understanding an order, refusing a line, thinking it was retreating, actually sucked in the British a little farther. So once for the Americans, a retrograde movement actually turned out to be okay. So Cowpens, Southern Campaign, another spot where my Marylanders did pretty well at. So those are the highlights there. There's the top highlights, but sorry.
And you good?
Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, there's a little bit of feedback coming through. So yeah, passing it over. Yeah, Billy, go for it.
Yeah, and I did mention Yorktown as well.
Sure.
That area down in Virginia between Jamestown, Yorktown, and Williamsburg is just awesome.
Yeah.
And Yorktown itself, the battlefield is very well preserved, and I think probably one of the most powerful spots on a Revolutionary War battlefield that you can stand on is the surrender field. And even though there's no action there, it's just obviously that is the result of the siege. Everything transpires there with Cornwallis surrendering, and for talking about a battlefield that involves an actual siege. The first time I went to Yorktown, I don't want to say I wasn't unimpressed, but I was a little taken aback at how small it was in scale, the field. And that's because my perspective had been skewed by visiting, Civil War siege sites like Petersburg, going overseas to World War I battlefields to the long trench lines. But for Yorktown, that for the Revolutionary War, that is a massive siege. And the battle itself helps tell that story.
That is, and we were joking before we got on that how long would we take to get a Civil War mention, and the 7 minutes is what it was. But
you can't escape it, Phil.
You can't escape it. But no, Yorktown, one of the neat things, and I've had the privilege and luxury to doing, is going to both Lexington and Concord. The first shots are around, and you're standing there at Lexington Green, and then going to Yorktown and just realizing what the difference of those 8 years. I mean, it's unfathomable that, hey, these and I mean, Lexington and Concord, there's another ones that are pretty well preserved. As long as you make sure that you say Lexington and Concord, because you don't want to combine them together. They don't like the end or whatever. I forget the exact pronunciation, but that we also had someone come in. Rob Orison has commented that Camden is the best preserved battlefield, and I'm sure he's a little biased.
Just ignore that guy when you see his comments.
That's comment. But if you want to know why he is biased, though, you can soon check out the next book in the Emerging Revolutionary War series. We're not above some promotion here, so that's the next one coming out in the series about Camden. You can understand why Rob Orson is biased about that, but we'll get back onto the battlefields there. But yeah, Yorktown is tremendous. I mean, it's I think 14 miles or so altogether. Put it in perspective. I mean, you're looking at sieges on other wars, just tremendously long. Petersburg. You go to, of course, what's happening over in it's like Stalingrad in Eastern Russia and so forth, where miles and miles, but 14 miles, still not short, but not what we believe in our minds built up. So, but I'm getting tired of hearing my own voice. So I'll pass it on to someone else here.
Yeah, I'll stay in the South and stick with the sieges theme that we have going and throw out 96 to folks. It's again, South Carolina It was in the backwater of South Carolina at the time of the American Revolution, still in the backwater of South Carolina. You really have to go out of your way to get to 96. But 96, again, looks just like it did in 1781 when Nathaniel Greene laid siege to the British garrison there. It has one of the, on the site, you can see one of the two remaining British forts that were constructed in South Carolina during the Revolution, the other being at Fort Farallon, which you can visit today. It's just outside of Charleston, but 96 is also a very cool site. And it also retains a lot of its historic character.
That's true. And going back to the comments real quick, it is Concord, not Concord. It's Concord like the book by Larry Daniels, not Concord like the airplane, the successful airplane. So so I apologize for our listeners coming in from the New England states. Sometimes my mid-Atlantic accent gets in the way, but 96, yeah, is very unique because, I mean, you also have the early on, the militia part, and then you have the 1781 campaign there as well. One of the other ones that I enjoy as well, and it was brought out is kind of on that preservation, not preservation side, is Brandywine, where you have these like pockets, and I think that's a sign of what happens when you can't preserve it all, because you kind of lose. It's that battlefield's always been kind of confusing to me. I know what happens, but you have pockets and so forth there, but it's
yeah, and the shame with Brandywine is it's really it's at the center of two crossing points, and Philadelphia expanding westward and Wilmington expanding northward. Fortunately, with the help of our partners there, American Battlefield Trust, as well as some other local organizations, have preserved land, and you can still visit. There are several locations across the battlefield. You can follow the battle fairly well, I think, in trails. And I believe in December 2021, we installed some interpretive signage at one of the properties that the trust owns. So it's still worth. It is heavily developed, but it's still worth a visit.
No, very true. And what before we move on to the other side of things than non-preserved battlefields or so forth, shout out both. Actually, this is the only time you'll see me as a true Baltimorean shout out to anything in New York. But New York state parks have done an amazing job of preserving things. Not only just the national park like Fort Stanwix, but you have like Oriskany, and then like some of the cantonments, New Windsor, and so forth. These small little sites. I mean, Oriskany is one of those pivotal battles that really make the American Revolution like the first Civil War. I mean, you have Native American tribes going after each other. You have the militia against some loyalists and so forth. And I mean, walking there, I mean, it's one of the most amazing monuments is there on that small little state battlefield historic site, Oriskany. And of course, the story of what Nicholas Herkimer, who's mortally wounded there as well. But part of that larger Saratoga campaign. And then, of course, we're getting some shout outs from the Palmetto State, the great Musgrove Mill, and what else? Blackstocks and other ones that these little, I don't want this not derogatory, but like postage stamp size preservation methods or places where you get the scope of what's happening, but they're pockmarked through. And I know later on we can touch about the Liberty Trail, which has been Dan's baby for a number of years. But all right, so we got our favorite battlefields. We've
real quick, Phil.
Oh, sorry, go for it.
So I was going to piggyback off you talking about New York state parks, and I'd like to mention one that is near and dear to my heart, and that's the Lake George Battleground State Park.
Yeah.
Right at the southern end of Lake George. And that, in my opinion, is one of the most important pieces of real estate on the entire North American continent. During the French and Indian War, the Battle of Lake George fought there in 1755. That ground is preserved. During the siege of Fort William Henry, the Battleground Park was actually the location of the outer entrenchment for the people who couldn't fit inside the fort. So that famous massacre of Fort William Henry actually happens on the ground of the park as those men and women are leaving their entrenched camp there on August 10, 1757. And then it is a staging area for James Abercrombie's massive offensive against Fort Ticonderoga in 1758. There was plans to build a large fort there, a stone fortification. Only one of the bastions were completed, and that bastion still is preserved within the park, and that was used as a supply depot for Burgoyne's army when he's coming south in 1777. There was a massive smallpox field hospital there. That was a staging area too for Richard Montgomery's prong of the Quebec invasion. Just a tremendous amount of history there, and very well preserved by the state, but also the Lake George Battleground Park Alliance too, who we have had on one of our ERW revelries before. So tremendous strides have been taken. They even just put in a visitor center last year and they opened it.
Oh, sounds like another trip north. The Lake George is needed. I mean, if we're going to go French and Indian War real quick, because of one of our compatriots, Mark Malloy, I'm going to step up and say, if you think that's one of the most important parts of land, Jumineville Glen, Fort Necessity, West Pennsylvania, the first shot heard around the world or whatnot, and everything. We can debate. We've had debates before on other revelries about whether Washington lied about sneaking up on the French, but you have these two sites basically on the periphery of these two states, Pennsylvania and New York, that are very, very important for the French and Indian War, the First World War. I mean, you put it bluntly. But yeah, so that might be another revelry. What is the most hallowed ground of the French and Indian War? And we'll get people on both sides, the Lake George side and the Washington crowd. So
and then the people up north with the Plains of Abraham.
In the Plains of Abraham.
Yeah.
There we go. We can make that. We're going to take this internationally. Yeah, it is. I mean, I'm sure we can get some people from Germany to go Minden or whatever else. We can. Yeah, we're taking this on the road. But back. So with preservation, of course, is essential to this hallowed ground, and of course, is the basis for Dan's organization that he works for. I mean, Billy works for the Gettysburg Foundation, which is also big about preserving, and he does great work with the leadership, getting people from outside business world and so forth to understand this. But the preservation, when you get in the mindset, we've said it earlier about preservation, how small Yorktown was. Sometimes we get in this mind of like preservation is going to save thousands and thousands of acres, but a lot of these battlefields are rather quite small when you put it in the big scope. Like Guilford Courthouse National Military Park is 250 acres. Lexington and Concord, there we go, I said it right, 970 acres. And so these are smaller plots of land. So Dan, I'll kick it over to you. Does this make it harder or easier when you're trying to preserve because of the size of these battlefields?
Ooh. It is, preservation, we like to talk about it being a sort of a long game. You're not going to it's very rare that you get one battlefield in one fell swoop. And you really have to do it, one small piece at a time. You're talking, it felt 250 acres of Guilford Courthouse. You might get a bite at the apple with 3 acres here, 4 acres there, and you just build on that. I think smaller, it tends to help, I think, in that degree, but it's also, I mean, there's so many other factors that go into it as well.
So right there. So if somebody wants to say donate and preserve land, what's the best way to do it? We'll throw that question out right now.
Reach out to us at battlefields.org.
There it is. Perfect. Plain and simple right there. Reach out to battlefields.org.
Yeah. And there's so many different ways that you can preserve land. I mean, land easements is one of the biggest tools that we utilize. So, I mean, there's a number of things that you can do.
And all of us have had experience working alongside or with the National Park Service, and you're at these different historic sites, and it's tough, especially when you get people whose ancestors fought or died or bled at these places, and they're like, oh, I want to get that spot where my ancestor fought or breathed his last, and you point out and go, oh, it's that shopping center or that development has taken it over and so forth, and you just see that look of like, oh man, come across their eyes and so forth. But then of course you have the flip side when you can actually get someone to those spots, and that's amazing. But so yeah, preservation is key. Before we can I want to keep this more free flowing, but this could be a heated debate. What is the worst preserved battlefield that has been lost to history in the American Revolution, and why? Let's start this conversation. See which ones come out.
I think the saddest case is Trenton.
Sure.
See, for probably one of the most important battles of the American Revolution and all of American military history, the battlefield itself, at least open space does not exist. Now, we are fortunate that the roads there where the battle was fought still follow along the same path, so you can point things out using those. And where the battle monument is today, it still sits on high ground where Henry Knox had posted artillery. So it is possible to interpret the site. It's just battlefield wise, there's nothing much to see, and it's not necessarily a place that you want to bring your family to.
That's unfortunately putting it mildly, but yeah. Dan?
Yeah, I mean, New York, Phil and I, you were talking about New York comes to mind. First thing that comes to mind when it comes to preservation wise, but I think Billy makes a great point with the importance that surrounding Trenton, I think, is a greater loss to the story and understanding the overall scope of the story, what happens late 1776, early 1777.
It is. No, it definitely there. I mean, when we were scouting out the one bus tour and you're standing there along the Assunpink Creek, and it's just trying to put that perspective and how important, not only, I mean, amazing the first battle of Trenton or so forth when they come over, which, I mean, saves the American Revolution. And yes, Mark Malloy, I did say saves the American Revolution. And then the second one where Washington, you see, I mean, just the prowess of Washington as a leader evolving, getting them to Princeton, which luckily has some preservation. New York as well. Tough when you're trying to find the plot of where the Marylanders charged there, and it's on the side of, I think, a mechanic's shop, saying here's where it is and so forth. But another one was brought out this by Christopher Jenkins, Bunker Hill, out there in Boston. And I'll add that Bunker Hill, and then on the other side, Dorchester Heights, which, I mean, is the pivotal linchpin for the British evacuating Boston there in the spring of 1770, spring of 76. And they had the Halifax, but I mean, yeah, you have the monument there that overlook. I mean, and flying into Boston or driving around, I mean, you can see it sitting over there, and you realize. But I think that's the only, and the Park Service has that visitor center there, but that's it, just where the monument sits and so forth. I mean, and it's not even on Bunker Hill anyway, right? It's on Breed's Hill, so we can't even get the right preservation down. But I'm sorry, go on.
Yeah, I'll also throw out another one. This one comes to mind, but it may not be as obvious. But the 1779 Siege of Savannah. And really, it takes place. The British lines are now are completely gone. American lines are completely gone. They've just been eaten up by the city of Savannah. Francis Marion fights there. It's where Casimir Pulaski is mortally wounded and killed. So that's another one that comes to mind. But it's not. It's not really readily apparent. You don't really see the American Revolution when you visit Savannah. So.
No, there's that little, and it's so cool of a story, the Savannah, about it's such the international flavor of it. And of course, the mortal wounding of Casimir Pulaski, and and his contributions as a Polish officer, and so forth. I mean, you want to do that, you could even say that the Siege of Charleston, what's left of, I mean, overshadowed by what happens later on. As well, but so there's the big ones. Are we missing a smaller one? I mean, there's kind of
another one that's lost to complete urban development is Germantown.
Yeah,
we're fortunate there are still some historic structures standing within the part of the city there that again can help interpret. When it comes to interpreting these fields, as I mentioned with Trenton, it's not necessarily about preserving open space, but if there's still landmarks that remain, you can still tell that story. Like with Trenton, I mentioned the roads. There's some churches there. You have the old barracks museum there. So there are possibilities. There are options. Yes. And as we've seen the incredible Mark Malloy lead a tour of Trenton, it can be done.
And I did have to reply to a comment that since Mark Malloy is not on the call, for those that don't know who Mr. Malloy is, but him and I have had healthy debates about what saves the American Revolution, and is it Trenton or is it just Washington himself? But Germantown, if I could just speak for a moment, I mean, talking about pivotal battles or battlefields, obviously there's you've got Cleveland or Cliveden that's still there, and then a little bit of some of the other houses. But it is one of those battles that gets completely talking about overshadowed by, of course, the major victories at Bemis Heights and Saratoga up north, but at Freeman's Farm. But it is one that actually plays a major part. When I was writing the book on Valley Forge, a little bit about the French and them coming in at that time. Saratoga is the highlight, but Germantown shows Washington and the prowess of the main army that less than a month after being defeated at Brandywine, losing the capital of the colonies, Washington is within a very lucky and meteorological phenomenon of actually destroying part of the British army there in early October of 1777. And that also shows that Washington is still in command and control of the army. So amazing battle. Michael Harris has written a great book on it as part of it. So definitely overshadowed by Saratoga, rightfully so in many ways, but other ways definitely owns its own right. And as people, we have at least preserved as Brooklyn, Leslie's Retreat in Salem. We've had some great comments coming in. It's barely preserved, just a small city park surrounded by commercial buildings. One of those cool little tales of the early period where they march across the bridge, 100 paces, stop, turn around, and come back. Just things that you read about initially in history books, and you go, "Wow, like that's it there." So the bigger things, preservation. Wise, we've kind of run the gamuts. Let's open it up for further discussion. Is there a preservation moment that has excited either of you two that you've seen come across, or that you're eager to see get preserved here in the near future? Something that could really help expand what we are all interested in this early period of American history. Figured to throw a good question out like that. If you guys are taking a moment, I will keep talking. I have some comments.
I'll tip in first, and as Phil mentioned, one of the major efforts that I've been involved with, and the trust's been involved with our partners at the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust in South Carolina, is the Liberty Trail, which is preserving the battlefields of South Carolina. In fact, Georgia as well, Kettle Creek in Georgia. But preserving the battlefields of the Southern Theater, the Southern Campaign, primarily obviously in South Carolina. But another big one, and Billy mentioned this a few minutes ago, ties in with the story with Trenton, but at Princeton, Maxwell's Field, and Washington rallying the Continentals and leading a counterattack against the British event that won the day and capped off what is known as the 10 crucial days that helped completely shift the focus and the trajectory of the American Revolution.
So yeah, the Liberty Trail. One of the neat things that I'd like to see happen, I'm not sure if it's going to, is more emphasis and interest in kind of the frontier. I mean, George Rogers Clark, the battle that's happened in St. Louis, the roll down, and of course, spending a number of years in Florida, always have to campaign for what happens in, of course, Pensacola, or the American efforts to try to get into St. Augustine and so forth, which plays a role. I mean, the importance there too, that's understudied by the British the reason they're evacuating Philadelphia is because of the French involvement and how important Florida and the Caribbean, the West Indies are. And so I'd also, I'm going to campaign just because I'd love to be the first site manager there of the first marine amphibious landing there in the Bahamas. If someone wants to, most times of the year, I will be the site manager there. I will gladly represent American interests there in the Bahamas. I could drink rum instead of whiskey really easily. But so preservation, and recently scholarship has started to come out on more of the international implications of the American Revolution. So I think that's a cool story that somehow we could interweave not only between the Baron von Steuben's and the Polish officers and so forth, but preservation of what this means as outward from these battlefields. So that's me grandstanding, though, campaigning the Bahamas and preservation. But we also have a ploy I'm amazed at the comments and stuff that are coming in today about preservation or lack of. Judith has thrown in the loss of the battlefields of Connecticut Farms and Springfield.
Yeah.
There in New Jersey. So battlefields that have small little markers right outside. What is that? That's not the Forge Wars battles, are they? Or is that part of that?
No, that's
Yeah, that's in. Yeah,
1780.
go ahead.
I was gonna say it's Clinton kind of probing out of New York City into New Jersey. And his last efforts to try to kind of get at Washington.
Again, so that's is that the Forge Wars then is when he's trying to get at Washington, or is that and Springfield and Connecticut Farms are different then, correct?
Yeah.
I know I should probably know everything, but I do not that. We also have Dave has said that the state of Ohio has announced the building the replica of Fort Lauren is now ready to go. So
Nice.
there's a guy talking about lack of preservation. I think they just recently found where he is, right? John Lawrence, where down on the
Combahee.
Combahee, there it is,
Mm.
Combahee
Yep.
River. A place that he should have no spot in. Talking about it, one of those fruitless deaths. I guess every death in battle is lamented, but that one, Lawrence it's just, what is he doing? That's the number one question.
Yeah, and I mean that battlefield was found because of archaeology, and it just goes to point. We have a special guest joining us as well. It just goes and it underscores the value of archaeology and helping us not only understand the past, but locating some of these battlefields that we thought were at one point in time lost.
So I mean, yeah, preservation, archaeology, all adds to the overall scope. So now talk about so is there I hate to say this question, but going to, is there battlefields that are over preserved or over interpreted in your minds, or should need a refresh of interpretation?
I think if maybe, yeah, for like a refresh or a battlefield that is underinterpreted
There you go.
would, one in my opinion, would be the Carillon battlefield outside of the walls of Ticonderoga. Because there's only a small stretch off the road where they have, you know, the rebuilt, preserved French earthworks there with a few signs. But I know recently they have added some more walking trails and to get you just at least out to explore some of those areas. But that the region right outside there, the walls of Ticonderoga, it is all still preserved. I mean, even if it's not actually interpreted, it is preserved. You know, the bloodiest battle fought in the North American continent all the way up until the American Civil War. It is definitely a very, very important piece of real estate. And Ticonderoga itself is worth a visit for anybody who's interested in 18th century history.
Definitely, I'll second that. I mean, it's
Third. Motion
And it-
passes.
and it's amazing. I mean, you just come upon it, and you're like in the wilds of New York, and this thing just poof, and it's just impressive. I mean, rivals anything in the Western Hemisphere of this the just construction and being able to do it. I mean, in engineering and so forth. Not underinterpreted, underappreciated. I'll throw out the race to the Dan, or the crossing to the Dan. Usually there's nothing sexy about a retreat. There's nothing that's glorious about miles and miles of trying to get away from the enemy as quick as possible. But it's one of those, you understand the larger scope, the war that when we'll see it later on with the kind of the slash and burn techniques that the Russians use in War II or so forth, where you're drawing the enemy out. And I mean, Washington or Greene does that tremendously, and it's Greene's lack his preparation beforehand. How much goes into planning, understanding the rivers, understanding the topography, understanding the supply routes, things that don't get really discussed, that he learned a lot as a quartermaster or in support services, or unfortunately taking his lumps in New York at Fort Washington. And he takes that into the Southern Campaign. And so South Boston, Virginia has a great little exhibit and everything, because where he ends up. But I think that's a remarkable trail that needs to be better emphasized. And there's some good books that have recently come out about it. And we had one of the authors here about 2 years ago, To the Ends of the World, I think it was, about who's an environmentalist, which was very interesting to hear his take. He looked at it, of course, from a different standpoint. And then I think something that needs a refresh is, it led me when you said something about Ticonderoga, is Henry Knox's amazing removal of the artillery to Boston, and being able to do that, especially too, which gets underappreciated, is that his wife Lucy is of course from a very pro British or loyalist family, and he gets her out of Boston and goes, oh, by the way, hang out with these people for a little bit in this house. I'll be gone for a few months trying to find artillery. And she said, I mean, let's give a shout out to her for supporting the wait. You just removed me from everything I knew, and now I'm staying with these people, and you're going where for how long? So bringing those guns back, which I mean, basically makes the siege of Boston a success for the American side. So I know there's at one time there were markers or someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think there's some markers, but I don't know if the trail is still in existence or who maintains it. But I would like to see that.
All the markers are still there along the sides of the road.
So something with literature or something like figure out. I know there's a recent history a few years ago that was written about it, and so forth. But it's something that just a cool, awesome story of Henry Knox and the removal of those guns from Fort Ticonderoga. But which if we're talking about it, there's also Fort Ticonderoga, there's initial action of the takeover with one of Billy's favorite people of the American Revolution. They talk about needs of rehabilitation is Benedict Arnold, but him and was it Ethan Allen that are initially there, and everything, and there's that early part. So Fort Ticonderoga, I mean, layers upon layers of history that are just so important to the United States history. So those are my picks. But let's keep the conversation going. So we've got preserved battlefields, our favorite battlefields. Let's what's a cool story from some battlefield, an experience you had, an interaction? We've all led tours, some crazy fun, someone on your tour.
I mean, I always like leading people around Monmouth. I mean, I'd feel bad if I didn't give Monmouth a shout out. It's probably the best preserved, I'd say, New Jersey battlefield that's out there for the scale of it as well. Always for the afternoon actions of the battle, because that's a battlefield where the first half of it, the morning engagement, when Charles Lee is butting up against the rear of Clinton's army as they're leading Freehold and the action commences, basically that whole part of the battlefield has been developed. But then where the Monmouth Battlefield State Park is the afternoon action. And it is very well preserved, great walking trails there, great visitor center, great staff. They have a friends organization as well that helps to continuously interpret that battlefield. I know Phil and I just recently actually took the Newark office of the U.S. Secret Service around Monmouth for a tour, and that was an incredible experience. So very fortunate that being part of Emerging Revolutionary War has opened up those opportunities where we have been able to be introduced to groups like that and help them learn this history.
Just hit a chord real quick before we move on, Billy, with John Resto giving you the shout outs of putting Monmouth. So nice to see you tuning in, John, but go on, Dan. Didn't mean to cut you off there.
Oh, no. I will go back to my first one. Eutaw Springs is a great place to give tours. But I'll go back to one of Billy's in Yorktown. Yorktown is it's you can do it in a day, but given the size of the battlefield itself, you can do it in 2 hours. And it's even, there are trails, but even then you can go off the trails and get a group around the entire battlefield. Essentially do a loop circled that starts at the visitor center. You can go out to the French or the Allied siege lines, parallels, and then up to reconstructed redoubts 9 and 10, then back to the visitor center. So that's another one of those battlefields that I really enjoy giving tours at.
And so we had a question come in, then I'll actually throw my answer out. But is there anything preserved at Valcour Island? So we had a question. Does anyone know?
Yeah, Lake Champlain.
Lake
It's
Champlain.
preserved. Yep. It's still there. But now Valcour Island still does exist. There is actually a marker there near where the battle site was, in that little inlet between the western shore and then or eastern shore, Lake Champlain, western shore of the island.
There you go. So great. Someone, wrote in, had the question there. So I'm glad we were able to answer that. One of the and I'm going to go out of the Rev War a little bit because it was very awesome to actually do. It was last weekend giving the initial tour of for teachers to the Battle of North Point, War of 1812, the land site. One of the things I think is great about what we do at Emerging Revolutionary War, and then it dovetails nicely with the American Battlefield Trust, is putting people in these hallowed places that usually they would never go visit. I mean, especially because of the lack of preservation, or which reinforces the need for an organization like the American Battlefield Trust to be around. But going to these, because there's 3 or 4 different sites attributed to North Point. Of course, like any tour you do, you start to run out of time. You want to hit it all, and then you start winning it down and so forth. But yeah, North Point, which rightfully so in a lot of ways gets overshadowed by the bombardment of Fort McHenry. But it is the pivotal part of destroying the land-based operation of the British two-pronged from the Navy Army joint operation, and also the death of the British commander Robert Ross. And it was what's great about giving tours and programs is you're supposed to be the quote unquote expert on the field, but you always have visitors or guests who have this unique knowledge on a specific subject. And one of the guys credited with killing Ross, McComas, his family is still in existence in Howard County, named after John Edgar Howard. And runs a funeral home that is on this major intersection that I used to go by when we would go out from Baltimore to visit relatives in Carroll County. And so passed it for years and years and years, never knowing that this guy's was one of the 2-3 credited with firing the rifle shot into Robert Ross there in September of 1814. So that's the preservation there. Another one, we have a gentleman, Bill Welsh, come to visit the Revolutionary Battle of Petersburg, Virginia.
Yep. Blandford.
And so, and then of course the death there of what William later, not at the battle, but William Phillips, the death there, what that
Buried
means, buried there, and so forth. And then it's remarkable that you have these battlefields over in Virginia. I mean, you go to Yorktown, of course, the main highlight, but Green Springs as well. Great
Spencer's
Bridge, Spencer's Ordinary, Great Bridge. Petersburg, the fighting at Lafayette and von Steubenville. And then of course even some of these the raid to Monticello and Charlottesville by Tarleton. Also some of the encampment sites. That's one of the neat things about these preservation of American battlefields is you have Valley Forge and Morristown both preserved as major encampment sites, which I think is, to correct me, I mean there's by default in that later war that we have sites preserved, but we don't have any site completely dedicated to a winter encampment in the Civil War, where we have a state park in New York and 2 national park units for the American Revolution.
And there's even a tiny park for the Middlebrook encampment as well. And a lot of the structures that were used as officers' headquarters too are still preserved, and a lot of them either run as historical societies or museums, like the Wallace House or Washington was in Somerville.
But what does not stand though is the tavern at Basking Ridge. That would have been great.
Yep, the Little White's Tavern.
Little White's.
There is a sign there. It's a overgrown lot, so it's not like there's any modern structure on it.
So what you're saying is we could get money together, redo the tavern, and then we could sit there and just drink and commemorate Charles Lee.
And that's right, Charles Lee National Historic Site.
There you go. We'll petition the American Battlefield Trust to see if we can save that land.
Yeah, well, the trust does have, at least in Culpeper, the Army of the Potomac's winter encampment is 63-64, a number of acres preserved from the Army of the Potomac's winter encampment right before the beginning of the Overland Campaign, which will soon become a state park. in July of next year. So there's a fair amount in Culpeper that's been preserved from, just talking encampment sites from the Civil War. But I'll also
Stafford.
go back to, what's that?
I was at Stafford Civil War Park too.
Yeah, there's a Stafford Civil War Park. But I think the expanse of Culpeper is much larger than what's been preserved at Stafford. Unfortunately, much of Stafford has been, as we can all attest to, it has been heavily developed. But I'll also go back to what Phil mentioned about Great Bridge. Great Bridge is a very neat little site that I'd highly recommend visiting. You do have to drive a ways depending on where you're coming from, but the Friends group down there is fantastic. They've put together a really nice museum and visitor center, fantastic facility there. So I would highly recommend, if you have the opportunity, you would take a visit over to Great Bridge.
And we were, I guess I should answer one of my own questions about, we were talking about memories or greatest thing on battlefields and so forth. It was actually come up today. 5 years ago, I was serving as the chief of interpretation at Morristown National Historical Park, and I had to go get groceries. So I was going to Target or wherever I was going to find, and I started finding signs for the Battle of Bound Brook. And so as a history nerd, of course, now I'm interested. And so someone did mark that Short Hills and Bound Brook and other ones need better interpretation. I do agree, because not only did I have trouble finding these sites in the dusk hours, but it took so long that Target was actually closed by the time I got to Target to get groceries. So if Bound Brook had better interpretive signs, I would have actually had groceries that night. Instead, I was forced to eat fast food the next day. So the Red War is still causing issues today. But just one of those neat stories, like you see that sign, how many people drive along the road, you see a sign,
Yeah.
you go, oh, I'm going to turn it over and try to, and then you go down these rabbit holes. Had another one where I did the same thing in Montgomery County, Maryland, and realized that was named after Richard Montgomery, the general fell. And it was actually Maryland's way of saying like up yours to the British, because it's one of the first colonies, territories, mentions, counties that our name is changed, or when it's split off from Frederick and not named for anything related to the British monarchy or back to British royalty or so forth. So I'm sure we could enter into a very long discussion about all the various side tracks that we go on and preservation. But as we wind down though, here last 10-15 minutes, is there anything that we've missed talking about great Revolutionary War battlefields or anything of that nature?
How about, what is your favorite monument on a Revolutionary War battlefield?
We all can't say the boot, right?
The boot marker?
is that number one and all and everything? Ooh, that is a good one though. I won't pick that one. Anybody else feel free to jump in. I'm trying to like catalog all the ones down my head
It's a monument. Technically, it's a monument, but it's also a headstone, a gravestone, and that's John Marchbanks at Eutaw Springs. I think that's the one that stands out. He's a British officer, dies shortly after the battle takes place, and he fights obviously at Eutaw Springs, and he's brought from his initial resting place back to the battlefield. So,
well, that's a good one. One that's coming to my mind right now was just kind of neat to find and so forth. When Rob and I were doing the books on Lexington and Concord, Lexington and Concord, we found the one at Lechmere Point where the British landed, and Boston has been filled in, has grown a little bit and so forth. So it was really neat to get to that. I think it's outside of a office building, or it's a large story building today, and having that little monument, and then also trying to get pictures of it, and everyone else. I mean, hundreds of people walking by during the day, middle of the day in the Boston's area there, just taking a picture and realizing that like what this would have been like 1775. I mean, dark Back Bay, British landing, getting across the Back Bay, and what those men would have thought marching off into the dawn. That, and then the Liberty Tree one where the marker is, and doing something totally American there and eating a Dunkin' donut while standing at the Liberty Tree marker in Boston. Kind of one of the highlights of my my historian nerd career. So
Yeah, I'll say for mine, since we're not using the Arnold Boot Monument, the Princeton Battle Monument, I think is incredibly impressive.
yeah, that's a good one. All right, but so let's think, man, let's just kind of go down this rabbit hole. What is your favorite statue of a military figure from the Revolution on a battlefield? Now that there's just two that come to mind. I like Green's at Guilford,
Yeah, that's a great one.
and I like the new Baron von Steuben one at Valley Forge.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So I think there's an impressive one. Location is everything.
And von Steuben has the one at Monmouth as well.
Mhm.
I mean, but the one at Valley Forge where he's just looking out across the
Yeah.
drill field is just, you're just like, yep.
That definitely played a lot more important of a role there at Valley Forge than he did at Monmouth.
I mean, you have to book at him though. I mean, like he's Valley Forge and Monmouth. I mean, you
It's
can't
true.
have one without the other.
I'll go back to the monument one real quick, but another one that comes to mind is the monument at Kings Mountain, on top of Kings Mountain. That's a pretty decent one. And I mentioned, just to clarify something I said earlier, Marchbanks has a headstone. There's the DAR monument that's next to his grave that was placed right next to him. So
And I got here's a one shout out. Anthony Wayne is getting some love on our comments, which I don't think I could probably go the rest of my life without saying those words in that sentence. Anthony Wayne is getting some love.
Except for his Valley Forge equestrian.
Valley Forge equestrian
that's a good
but
one.
Nicholas with the winner. I like the Anthony Wayne one at Falling Timbers outside Toledo,
Yeah.
Ohio.
Oh yeah.
Impressive. That's the one I've not been to Fallen Timbers, so that is on the bucket list of battlefields.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one.
And then Christopher with I like the Captain John Parker statue on Lexington Green comes to mind. Although he probably did not utter his famous words there, but he's one of those unsung heroes. I think later on that day, talking about being on the battlefield, of having his militia still under arms and ready to fight the British as they come back from Concord that afternoon, after basically having bloodied that morning, and then having the first shots be right in the middle of their town, that he's able to keep under command and control, which is a better testament than whether he actually said, if they mean a war, let it begin here or whatnot. So a few more that came in. We've got Mary Corbin's grave. Princeton is fantastic. The Boston Landing at Charleston Navy Yard. So yeah, just a few there. But before we do end though, we're coming to
mention too real quick. Since we're going off battlefield for some of them, but Mary Hayes, Molly Pitcher's statue done by J. Otto Schweitzer above her grave right in the old Carlisle Cemetery.
Yeah.
Pennsylvania is really well done.
Agreed.
That's a good one. So so as you start to wrap up here, any last things that we've got there? We have famous battles, unpreserved sites, preserved sites. We went down some rabbit holes. This is literally a historian happy hour extraordinaire. So really appreciate it, gentlemen. Also everyone. Oh, wait, one more come in. The Washington at the Ford Mansion at Morristown across the street. Good equestrian statue there. Everything. But any last comments or any plugs for preservation? Any initiatives that you're allowed to talk about, Dan or Billy? Anything going on?
I mean, I would just say, the best way to experience these battles and get an understanding of the past and the people who lived through them is get out on the ground, walk the ground as much as you possibly can.
Yep.
Perfect. And to do that, I mean, there are some American Battlefield Trust is doing twilight tours and so forth this year. There's ones at places, I think, aren't you doing Princeton, Billy? Or have that already happened?
No, not yet.
So there's one in Princeton. I know a few others from Emerging Revolutionary War are helping doing one down at Guilford later in the summer as well. So that's the way to do it. Battlefields.org to find anything from preservation to their conferences to just maps, some great overlay maps and so forth. EmergingRevolutionaryWar.org, which as we get primed for the America's 250th, which is coming up. I mean, at the end of this calendar year, you have the 250th of the Boston Tea Party. Is a site for how to keep up to date with what's going on and so forth. So, but we were also, remember, we're back to the 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks from now, we will be back talking about actually the Battle of Camden, all that can be expected, the Battle of Camden and the high tide, the British high tide in the South, which happens to be the title of the next book in the Emerging Revolutionary War series that is outcoming. So we really Southern theater centric. We have the siege of Charleston, and now Camden. We also will be going to Charleston in November, Mark Malloy, and we'll actually be visiting Eutaw Springs as well. We'll have the ranger and historian Bert Dunkley on, another great historian for Emerging Revolutionary War. He's a little, but not perfect, because he does have a very bad choice in sports teams, but we won't go down that route. So remember, 2 weeks from now, Emerging Revolutionary War will be back live here with talking about Camden. That is the first weekend of August there. But we thank everyone for joining today. All your comments about all the interest, all these small little battlefield historic sites. We really appreciate your comments, because it also shares it with other folks about how to go visit. Now I really want to go to Fallen Timbers myself. So, but also too, I'd like to thank Dan Davis and the American Battlefield Trust for being part of this as well. And also Billy, thank you for joining in.
Thank you.
So any before we wrap up here, any last comments, thoughts, suggestions? All right, well, from all of us, Emerging Revolutionary War, we thank you for tuning in, and we will see you back here in 2 weeks for the next Rev War Revelry. Have a good evening, everyone.